All right, I'm going to call this Operations Committee meeting to order. First on the agenda, we have the approval of the minutes from our Thursday, August 27th, 2020 meeting.
Make a motion to approve the minutes.
Second call.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. All in favor say yes.
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 All opposed, same sign. Okay, thank you. So we have our new business, number 3 on our agenda, and we will first start off with Tom Greco, Mr. City Clerk. Thank you, sir.
Good afternoon, councilors. Tom Greco, City Clerk. The first thing I'll talk about is, so as you recall, we'll be discussing an ordinance that was referred to this committee back in April. So the ordinance itself is an ordinance of the City of Sioux Falls, South Dakota, amending the Code of Ordinances of the city by amending Chapter 30, ordinances, resolutions, motions, and other documents requiring council approval by requiring an annotated agenda. So the purpose of this particular item, what I would like to do is just provide some recommendations, and what you'll find are my recommendations are really rooted in expanding upon this ordinance to a large extent. And let me just grab the mouse here. So this is the recommendation right here. No other changes to this particular section of ordinance, and except this one blue line here. Right now, as it stands, each person submitting an agenda item, an agenda approval form, generally for resolutions, motions, and ordinances, are required to submit a background and purpose or background and objective statement for each item. So if you go online right now, you can look at an agenda approval form and find that background and objective. The goal with this is to take that background and objective as written by the submitter and put it onto the agenda itself. So if you just picture our ordinances and our resolutions right now, they have the sponsor under them. They might have a recommendation of a first reading. Below that, you would see background and objective. And that was the original intent of this particular ordinance. And I personally believe it's a good idea because it does provide for a little more consumability, I guess is the best way to put it, of the agenda. But what I would ask, Mr. Chair, is that in order to better explain this, the annotated agenda, because I think we can possibly go beyond just the background and objective statement, with your permission and the committee's permission, if we can move into our discussions for item number 2, the proposed revisions to the policy manual, because ultimately what I'll recommend to the committee is that we simply strike with each agenda item and leave consolidated into a single annotated agenda. And as I go through the policies and procedures, that should make a little more sense.
Yes, please
Okay.
go ahead.
So there are a couple things between myself and Jim David, the Chief of Legislation and Policy. We'll be talking about some proposed changes to the City Council operations, the Policies and Procedures Manual. Last updated in 2020, there was quite a few changes back then. Of course, these are our recommendations, and anything's open, obviously, to the committee. But one thing I do want to point out, just as I'm scrolling through this, is I did omit pages that we did not make changes on. Okay, so the first thing I want to address, which is not the annotated agenda, I'll get to that in a moment, is just simply the meetings and events listing that you get on a weekly basis. And I just kind of wanted to put this as a recommendation for inclusion in the policies manual, because each week we do send out a consolidated list of what we call meetings and events. And that's used by the news media, the public at large, and of course the council themselves, basically to keep track of what's going on. What I wanted to do here is just memorialize the process by which we do that, so there's a clear understanding of how items land on there and what purpose those items serve for being on there. So I'll just talk through this particular section very briefly. So what it does say, and I will basically read it, what it does say is that the clerk will prepare and post a consolidated listing or calendar of meeting and events. And that's an important distinction. Right now we send what I would consider a listing. We call it a calendar, but it's really just a listing of the meeting and events. So the listing of the calendar will include official meetings. Those official meetings, consequently, are already properly noticed. We used to call this thing the notice of public meetings, or, it went by various names over time. Our notice comes in the form of an email that's sent out Friday afternoon, posting on the web and posting on the front door of our agendas. But we include it on this calendar just because it makes sense to have everything in one place. So those will include the official meetings held pursuant to city ordinance and state law. But also there's another component to, and I'll just flip down here, SDCL 1-25 has quite a bit about this, basically how things are noticed and what is to be noticed. One of the items that's included in the statute says, basically you can also list what amounts to a notice of quorum. So we have our official meetings, but then we also have those non-governmental entities that invite you consistently to events that they have. It could be anything from an event during the St. Patrick's Day parade up to, you know, a briefing by the Chamber of Commerce or something like that. Those are, you know, fairly, I wouldn't say defined, but they're articulated in state law. Basically, what state law says is that events hosted by a non-governmental entity to which a quorum of the council has been invited and public policy may be discussed, but the city council does not control the agenda. So those are a lot of the things you get invited to. We currently have those on the meeting and events calendar. Those items would be included on the meeting and events calendar. And the purpose of this is just to say, to memorialize again, that we are putting those types of items on there. I think it's important for folks to understand that not everything on that meeting and events calendar is an official meeting of the city council, okay? What I include on there is the latter, which are the events, is included on the listing. They'll constitute a notice of quorum. That's the language that's used in the state statute. And just for an understanding of the process, there's not any picking and choosing of what goes on. It's very basically a non-government entity that invites a quorum of the city council to a meeting. Generally what happens is the Chief of Legislation and Policy, Jim David, will receive those invites through the mail or via email, and he'll forward them to my office. In some other cases, we'll get them directly, but the point is they generally come from Jim's office, and that's how they land on the meeting and events calendar. Okay, so again, this is more for clarity why things are on there and to make the distinction between what is an official meeting and not necessarily an official meeting. I also included in this just some important points from the statute as well that don't necessarily need to be included on the meeting and events calendar. And we'll continue to include these things, but they don't have to be. I think it's important for people to understand why they're there. So it's not an official meeting of the city council if its members provide information or attend the official meeting of another public body for which the notice requirements of SDCL 1-25-1.1 and 1.3 have been met. That's basically another political subdivision has duly noticed a meeting. If you're invited to it, you may attend as long as they noticed it. You could attend as a quorum. The other point here, which often gets overlooked, is it's not considered an official meeting or even an event if its members attend a press conference called by a representative of the public body. So again, I think that's important for the council to understand. We will put those on the meeting and events calendar if we're apprised of them well ahead of time, but there's theoretically not a requirement to put them out there. So I would recommend inclusion of this language in the policies and procedures manual. You won't see much of a change from our office. Again, I think it's just important to memorialize. And then just another quick point, my office, we do currently send out a PDF. We will transition to a calendar-based listing, electronic calendar-based listing within the next month or so that people could download invites, et cetera. So do you have any questions on that?
Mr. Neitzer, Councilor Neitzer.
Thank you. This is something that's always been a point of a little bit of confusion over the years. So, case in point, let's say the mayor calls a press conference and they send out an advisory 8 hours before. Can a quorum of the council go to said press conference and not violate any law?
What the statute says is that it's not an official meeting if it's a press conference held by a member of the governing body, for which the mayor is.
So 5 councilors could attend it, and that's fine.
I would consult with the attorney's office on that, but my understanding is no. it's one of those exceptions in there. It's not an entity, and it's not, you know, another political subdivision.
As far as the other, so then obviously,
And consequently, if I could just say real
Yeah,
quick,
please.
I don't provide legal advice, so we could do some more research into that, but the reason I want it in there is just for a clear understanding of what the components to it are.
yeah, that would be good to know, because it does come up. Obviously, so the other part would be the county commission has a duly noticed weekly meeting, and multiple counselors show up. We don't have to do our own public notice. We can go
Correct.
and we can attend. And then, so if, let's say the chamber's having an annual dinner, so that is or is not
Would be basically a notice of quorum.
a notice of quorum, which just notices that
It's an
we're going to
event.
be there?
Yep.
But, and again, this would be a legal advice thing, I suppose, but, I mean, is it, as long as we're just talking about chamber stuff? I mean, do you have any idea, like, you know?
Well,
if-
I think, you know, even the guidance that's always provided, you know, and it's somewhere in the manual as well, is, you know, doing the public's business in public. And so the intent of this mostly is just to give an idea and an understanding of why certain events or, you know, calendar items land on that list. I think each individual event, you'll probably want to talk to Jim about, you know, the requirements of it, whether it's considered a political subdivision, and also, you know, where it falls into this particular statute. But I guess my key point is the items that are placed on that listing that you receive each week, my office doesn't do the analysis of what those events are and what types of organizations those are. We only differentiate between whether they're a private entity or a governmental entity.
And we could get legal advice, but obviously there's always the spirit and the letter of the law. So just in trying to be transparent, I would, common sense could potentially prevail.
Right.
Like if you're talking about the speaker at the said chamber dinner, that's one thing, but if you decide to veer off and start talking about an ordinance that's coming up on the agenda the next week, common sense would tell us all that, you know, even just from the spirit of the law in open meetings, that's probably not something that we should discuss.
Yeah, and it probably is a good idea to even get the city attorney in here, maybe for one of these future meetings, to kind of go over that kind of stuff in detail. Again, my intent is mainly focusing on the mechanics of the things that are on there.
Thanks.
Counselor Sale.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Tom, would it be, as we discuss these, I'm going to request that you float them over to 224 West 9th
Yep.
and have Stacy take a look at them. It's not something that's going to be changed overnight, but but if you could also put a timetable on it, I assume Stacy'd be watching this meeting, but put a timetable so that we need it done by the end of July, that'd be awesome.
So we can what?
So we could be done with it by the end of July and make a recommendation to the full council.
Yep. Yeah.
Thank you, and I appreciate your
And
insight.
this right here is only stating what is currently done, which has been reviewed prior. How it's interpreted and what's done with it is a different topic, I would suggest. But
Thank you.
we'll go.
Counselor Neitzer.
What about, and I know we've got to be cognizant of time too, but.
Understood.
What about, like, we've struggled with annual Christmas parties? I mean, I mean,
Again,
it's
wouldn't
very
give
difficult
legal
for us to
advice,
have
but
a team building deal,
You
so.
know, I think that's something that needs to be explored, and probably even the types of events that get put on this calendar, because those questions can get raised for nearly everything. Traditionally, you know, since COVID, the number of invites haven't been tremendous, but they are or have been picking up. And, you know, maybe there needs to be a screening process in terms of why or how they're added, you know, and maybe a little more research into what in particular they are. Because I think it's important for the council to know that just because they're on that sheet, it's not carte blanche, and I know you don't take it this way. It's not carte blanche to go out and formulate policy. But it does lead to those misperceptions that you stated before. And again, my intent here is just to make the clear distinction that the items that are on there are official meetings and events. And there are other things out there like press conferences, which may or may not be on there. You know, but you know that those may take some guidance, which based on Councilor Sale's comment, we could take care of.
Are there any other questions? Okay, I possibly just have, unless you're gonna keep
Yep,
going.
no, go ahead.
No, you can keep going, and then I'll ask my question
Okay.
at the end of your testimony.
So kind of the other thing here is the annotated agenda. And so as I mentioned before, the goal is to make it more consumable, not only to the council employees, but certainly the public, because, you know, we do get a large volume of people that come here to meetings. Typically what I see, and possibly what you may see before a meeting, people asking questions about when can I get up and talk, when can I do this, you know, when is my item going to be heard. People don't understand necessarily that you can change the agenda order around. So, you know, somebody who's slated at the end might not come until, you know, 7:30 or whatever, when you may have moved it up. I think just including some annotations on the agenda beyond just the background and objective would be beneficial. So what I recommend, and I will show you an example, I'm just going to run through these and then I'll show you an example. So basically all business types identified in 30.013 E through Q, that's basically everything from consent agenda on that has an actionable item under it. Generally just a brief description of what it is, and the time allowed for public comment on those types of items, okay? The next thing would be, and we do this already, but it's not memorialized anywhere, planning commission actions and votes. If something has gone through the planning commission and ordinance dictates what goes through the planning commission, will include the action, the recommendation, and the vote. Again, we do that already, but it's not memorialized. All first reading ordinances and noticed resolutions include the date recommended for second reading or hearing respectively. Again, we do that already, but it's not in writing anywhere. I think it's good to have it in here so that people know why we're doing that. It's simply a recommendation. So just keep that in mind. And then the last thing on the annotations are the background and objective statement, which I talked about before. Those would be included for ordinances, resolutions, and formal motions, okay? And as I wrote that, I added something else to this particular section, more so as awareness and something I think probably doesn't need to be in here, but I think it should, just to, again, memorialize it so people in the future understand why we are doing what we're doing. First is, I don't think all of these annotations need to be read into the record. State law requires that the title be read for resolutions and ordinances. You know, currently we read everything that's on the agenda down to the sponsor or the applicant. I would not recommend that we read the background and objective, and if the council desires, we just read the title and call it a day, but we can look at that closely kind of as time evolves. The other thing that I wanted to include is the fact that all motions submitted for consideration, that's a motion to appoint somebody or, you know, create a bump out somewhere on a road. We have typically, by custom, as far back as I can gather, on our agendas have included those under new business. That's not a proper place for them. I would just put it in policy that we start including those under resolutions and hearings, because it's ultimately a resolution. More for clarity, because as we went through that new business process a few months ago, we saw that new business is treated very specifically in city ordinance. So nothing should be there unless you bring it there at the meeting. So with that in mind, just some examples of what a sample agenda would look like. And this is not part of the policy. I think with the attorney's office and staff and counselors independently, we kind of work on the language here, but basically just explaining to the public what's going on, okay? Here's just an example for the consent agenda, why we have a consent agenda, how it's treated, and also the fact that anyone can pull anything off of the consent agenda. And then we just go through that process for the remaining action headers, okay? The regular agenda, it explains the public comment period, and then as we get down through everything else, it is sort of the same mantra where we describe what it is and the general actions that are associated with it. So for unfinished business, you get a presentation, you get public comment, and then council questions, a motion, debate, and a vote. Again, just education for the public, knowledge for the council, and another tool to help keep meetings on track.
Counselor Cole.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Will the mayor still explain that to the public, like you have 3 minutes or 5 minutes if it's one of the consent agenda?
Right now, there's not, I think he does a great job doing that each week. There's not a requirement for him to do that. I would say with something like this, we do provide hard copies of, I mean, he can. But the intent here is that, you know, somebody who walks in 3 minutes after the start of a meeting or a minute after that statement can pick up an agenda and know what the rules are. We do have them generally stated at the very end of the agenda, but not down to this level of detail.
Are there any other questions at this time? Anyone? Maybe this might be a good time for me to ask my question, and I appreciate everything that you've put into this and actually your work with Counselor Brecky at the time. And we, as a council, referred it to this committee so we could, you know, kind of talk about it more in an open forum and talk with you about it. But is there anything else that we, as an operations committee, can, you know, bring to the council and say, hey, this is how we can increase, you know, transparency to, you know, our constituents, the people that are coming to this meeting? Is there anything that we can do, from your opinion, that we can add to this or maybe revisit next quarter if we wanted to do a third quarter meeting?
Well, if you're asking my own personal observations, I think there are a few things that can be looked at. Number one is the order of business. We go through an awful large amount of regular agenda changes. Again, changing, you know, if you're planning on coming to a meeting for a particular item, you generally think it's going to be where it is on the posted agenda. I think we could change the order of business to make it more sensible, maybe something where we do all final consideration items at one time with the authority of the clerk's office to kind of group them as they can be. You kind of see where I'm going with that. The other thing I think might be useful or would be useful is if you look closely at our ordinances, there's really not much that governs, say, joint meetings or budget hearings or just really how we define how these meetings are used. I think that's something that could be looked at. Another thing that's often come up in the past is just communicating with citizens. Again, my own observation is we get a lot of folks that come up probably with with a lot of great input on agenda items, second readings, public hearings, just a good way to, you know, maintain some type of communication with them, particularly if they say something, you know, a council member the next day may ask any one of us, hey, do you know that person who spoke about whatever? And I guess we just don't really have a way of giving you that answer other than a name.
Okay, and I appreciate that answer, and maybe, you know, offline we can kind of work on some things, and then let's schedule a meeting in, you know, third quarter to kind of discuss more of that, because I think there's actual validity there, as each one of us have experienced, well, who was that individual, and, you know, what were they talking about with their zoning issue? Because, you know, I'd like to reach out to them. Not everyone just emails in, so that'd be, you know, exceptional. Okay. So I appreciate that kind of off-topic conversation, and we have Counselor Neitzer here with a add-on.
Speaking of grouping, what would you think of, and you know, it might be hard to figure out where to draw the line, but as an example, very typically you'll have a rezoning under a second reading, and you'll have an approval of a subdivision plan 25 items later in resolutions, but they're paired together.
Right.
I mean, would there be a sensible way that it could be? I mean, have you thought about, I've always thought maybe that could be done in a way that it could be just said that they're allowed to be paired. Right now,
Right.
They can't be by ordinance, but.
That would be my initial thought, and what I have thought about before is just kind of grouping, making a clear distinction between you know, your run-of-the-mill ordinances and resolutions, public hearings, very important, albeit we do take public input on every regular agenda item, but also kind of grouping things into final consideration and, you know, first readings or notices, so that we can do something like that and more sensibly put the agenda together.
Because those two always go part and parcel together. I mean, one is, and it's not just for the applicant having to sit around, it's also because we just got done talking about it, it's on our mind, and so addressing it. And many times it's said that, hey, you know, we're talking about the rezone here in this other item is when that question you had about how parking, whatever, is gonna work.
Yep.
It just, but you did make one other comment about something about if you regrouped them, and you said something like approve them together or something? Maybe I
No, I
misheard.
didn't
What-
say approve together, or
Or,
maybe
or
I
are
did,
you,
but I didn't
or
mean to.
are you just basically just saying that just doing things in a maybe more logical order? Is that all you're saying? You're not
Right.
suggesting we take,
Instead of parsing it out, second readings, first readings, resolutions, maybe something like ordinance, second readings, and resolutions, and then first readings, so that there's the flexibility in there to group things normally. But, you know, we do, you know, something, another thing that could be looked at is alcohol. Last night, I think I read an ungodly amount of alcohol items. We do notice those items. We do need to apprise the public that they're on there, but just, you know, little things like that. And I think maybe that's something I should have mentioned when Councilor Jensen, Chair Jensen asked that question is, you know, how can we just make the agenda and how we go through it more sensible and again, more consumable for the public so that we have an efficient meeting and give due time to the stuff that's needed.
I'm not trying to, I don't mind being here longer, having you read, you know, for 2 minutes or whatever, but I'm curious, when you read all of those, is that just something we do by convention, or like, because over at like, you know, I see similar things at county commission meetings where, and I'm not advocating we do this, but they'll just say, you know, approval of whatever, and that's just boom, they do it, and they seem to approve just this big block of stuff in one shot.
So by custom, we read all the alcohol items. In the past, first readings were read all at one time and one vote was taken to send them to a second reading. There might have been a time where we didn't even vote on second readings. They were just sent to the second reading. Robert's Rules of Order does say if something's noticed, there's not a necessity to actually read it into the record, but then there are also some state law requirements that we've got to look at. But I guess those are the kind of things, and based on your comment, that we could take a look at and come up with a proposal.
So I mean, I'm not advocating either way, but I mean,
Yep.
could it theoretically, could it be, you know, approval of the alcohol licenses for whatever, and that, just saying that would consume 25 of them, and then we would just make a
So
motion?
you do that
or-
on the consent agenda.
Okay. I assume there's some things that you can't put on a consent agenda. They have to be public hearings, and so they have to be
Right.
individual,
Yep.
but, okay, all right, thank
It's
you.
just something to look at. I think that's a good point.
And Tom, that could then be pulled off of a consent agenda if one of the public, which often happens, if they want to pull one off, they can pull one off, you know, with regard to the alcohol license.
Well, the alcohol, like Councilor Neitzer just said, would always be on the regular agenda because it is a public hearing. So it needs to be opened up as such and treated like that. Whether the items are each read individually, that's something I think can be looked at.
Okay, I think that'd be a great third quarter conversation for Ops Committee. Are there any other questions at this time? Okay, oh, Counselor Neitzer.
Sorry, did you have, you were going down and showing the example of the annotations with, of kind of like, where you give the guidance, which I think is wonderful for people, but did you have an example in there for an actual agenda item where you put in the
I probably
justification?
should have done that.
There
right
you go. So it's a you're cutting, essentially taking what's in the AAF, the agenda approval form, which I think is wonderful because there's so many, I mean, just as a transparency item, there's so many that you read it and it just has this legalese and it doesn't mean anything to anybody. And in fact, there's many times where I'm trying to review an agenda to get ready for a meeting and then I have to go click on the agenda approval form to read the background and information. And so if it's in one place, you know, because all I need out of that approval form is that background and objectives. So
Right.
This will be
And
wonderful
some,
for everybody.
knowing that some ordinances and resolutions are more complex than others. It's not a summary, it's the background and objective.
yeah, so like as an example, last night, you know, a resolution to gratuitously
Right.
whatever property. It's like
Give
what?
some land. I called, actually emailed Director Eckhoff and said, what are we giving away?
Yeah,
You know, it was
and so
like
this would have,
a 2-minute thing. 'cause it
answered the
wasn't ours.
question,
So this
so.
would be a great addition.
yeah.
Okay. So just the last thing, I would recommend, as the council, the committee's report at the July 19th meeting, that they recommend approval of this ordinance with an amendment to strike with each agenda item and. Because with each agenda item means we put a background and objective for every alcohol item that's on there. And I don't think that's particularly necessary. For years, Jamie has provided a memoranda that's seemed to serve everybody pretty well.
would we need to make that recommendation here?
If you could, can you maybe make a motion to recommend approval with the amendment to strike out with each agenda item and?
Yes,
Counselor Sale,
yes.
so moved.
Get it
Okay, is there a second?
I'll
Second.
Okay, Counselor Cole seconds that. All in favor, say yes.
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 Okay, all opposed, same sign. Okay,
All right.
that will be carried forward to the July 19th meeting.
Okay.
I appreciate your time.
We'll turn it over to Jim.
Okay. Mr. David, please step up at your convenience and brief the Operations Committee.
Good afternoon, councilors.
Good afternoon.
The Operations Committee was actually formed in 2012, and one of its first order of business was the establishment of a travel policy. There was a 3-page document that had existed, and the thought process at the time was that there needs to be more parameters on what is appropriate travel and who makes that decision on what is appropriate travel. And some of these are the changes that were made to the travel policy back then, and we'll get into more detail later on in the presentation, but pre-authorized versus all other travel or all other requests. Use of the Sioux Falls Regional Airport for council and council staff travel, and then finally a report following the conference in front of the city council at a public meeting. So if we get to the first change, it looks like the entire, on your document, it looks like this is all new language. Actually, what had happened is that this was at the tail end of the travel policy, and simply we just moved it to the very front end as an introductory statement going in. But if you look at your presentation or the document in front of you or the overhead, you'll see some of the changes that we are recommending. For example, we did strike out the city council budget shall include appropriations for education training for its members. In the past, there has been times when the council has made the determination because of budget constraints that it cannot include travel, money for travel. And also this document cannot bind future councils. Charter would do that. So I'm just recommending that we remove that language. Also adding in tours in addition to the types of travel that could take place. And then putting in a section here that says, and related to the city council's policy-making role, and then striking everything after, and of substantial benefit to the city council traveler, because how can you really interpret what substantial benefit means to the individual council member? Just some other tweaks in that first paragraph, and then just again clarifying that the city council member shall report key information following the attendance. We struck at or an event and then added training. The only reason for this is that there may be confidential travel that a counselor may partake in and that they cannot disclose what that event or what that travel may have entailed, such as if there's an economic development prospect that may be looking at locating in Sioux Falls. And then the other change to this section was removing city council members and their staff are active members in the Municipal League, National League of Cities. We just didn't feel it necessary to include that statement because there are times, there are council members who have obligations back at home and are unable to be active members of the Municipal League and other organizations. And so we felt it necessary just to strike that for that flexibility of council members. Also want to make it clear too that a travel request form is required for travel outside the city limits only if there's an expense of the city. If there's not an expense of the city, there's no need for a travel request form to be filed. So the other major change that we are making is in the determination of pre-authorized and all of the requests. When the Operations Committee originally looked at who approves travel, your 8 equal members of the City Council, is it appropriate for leadership to sign off on travel? There's even discussion at the time, maybe the Operations Committee shall approve travel. The decision was separating travel into 2 categories, pre-authorized and all other requests. Pre-authorized basically has been if the City Council is a member of the organization, it only needs a signature of the chair or vice chair if it's a chair that's requesting travel. If the chair or vice chair is uncomfortable signing that document or is unsure, that he or she can defer that to the full council, and then they would approve it at a public meeting. All other requests were those, all other organizations. If you were going to travel to see at a conference of an organization that the city is not a member of, you would need to go in front of the city council and ask for permission, and that would take a motion of the council. So changes. First of all, we clarified in here that pre-authorized travel includes events, conferences, and meetings of the state of South Dakota. There has been times when council members have visited with secretaries of various departments at the state level or other state officials. And so we just made sure that was clear that pre-authorized travel does include meetings with the state of South Dakota. We also made the determination to strike all of the organizations, knowing that there are going to be additional organizations that the city will become a member of, and there may be times that the city actually withdraws from membership of these organizations. And so we just struck that, felt that it was clear enough that if any organization in which the city is a member, clarified that. The change also was, the other change that we made was pre-authorized travel may include ground travel within 350-mile radius of the city of Sioux Falls that relates to the city council's policy-making role. So 350 miles, if you look at this map right here, covers most of the state of South Dakota, the entire state of Iowa, most of Nebraska, and a good share of Minnesota. And so what this would allow is if there is, again, an economic development prospect, it would allow the council to participate in those travels, whether it be in Minneapolis or Omaha. There's also been requests or talk of visiting some of the cultivation facilities that exist in other parts of the state. This would also allow council members to do fact-finding missions to better understand that industry and just have the signature of leadership. If leadership is uncomfortable signing those travel request forms, they can always defer it to the full council to be acted on at a public meeting. So, and then other than that, if you look at all other requests, it should be consistent with the city council's policy-making role. We didn't feel it was necessary to include all this other, this other section in here, just providing some, just have an overarching theme that it's part of the city council's policy-making role. Other than that, those are the only changes recommended for the travel policy. Happy to answer any of your questions.
Thank you, Mr. David. Are there any questions? Counselor Neitzer.
Thank you. Back to, it was one of your first changes. Can you go back a few pages? Oh, I know what it was. It was about the report to the city council.
Yes.
So as an example, let's say somebody wants to do like an online webinar. It's $75, like a, you know, whatever, like maybe Smart Growth America is putting on a thing about walkability or something like that. So you get that approved, and you do this 1 hour webinar. Does that fall in the expectation that you're going to go and do a report to the city council of what you learned?
You know, a lot of this is on the honor system, but as it's currently written, it would require that somebody who attends a conference or an event would need to report that meeting if there's an
Or
expense
training
associated.
event, I mean, you could.
If approved, that's new language, but exactly.
Yeah. I mean, I don't necessarily have a problem doing it, I just don't, you know, I mean, we just would want to think about whether or not we want to go to the trouble of, you know, an informational meeting that you literally attended a 45-minute little webinar about learning about the basics of cultivation or something, and then you have to make a presentation to the city council. I don't know if that's, what, in lieu of, and then maybe somewhat related, I wonder, so the chair obviously has the authority to approve. I wonder if there could be, if there should be maybe a roster or some sort of record, and I don't know if it would be, and I don't, it's fine with me if it was public record, that'd be totally fine, but at the, you know, if there's some sort of thing in which one could see, any counselor could see all of the money that was expended and see that, you know, just, I mean, even just a measure of accountability, I guess, so that, you know, you could look and see like how much travel or training has gone on, and then that might inform a counselor as to whether or not there's, you know, going forward, maybe we need to look at some changes, because I don't think that's what we, you know, or I don't know. I mean, there could be a lot of reasons just in which, you know, that way it's not, the onus isn't only just on the city council chair or whatever, just so there could be a review of like, how much, what kind of training was done? Because it's not just travel. I mean, there's various, very, very nice, very good things that you can do, you know, electronically. I mean, you could do $1,000 week-long seminar without having to travel to the National League of Cities or something like that, you know, or whatever, so.
I know the operations committee had looked at something, what you're talking about, a public document that would illustrate where each counselor has traveled, how much they have expended. But I think at that time, the thought process is they did not want to shame particular members who may participate in more of those activities and say, look at here's Counselor X who's spending so much money compared to Council Y who's so frugal and doesn't go anywhere and doesn't do anything. And so there is that part. I know that you do have, as council members, the ability to request those figures at any time on who has traveled and how often and how much.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, there's, you know, I mean, you don't want to have a situation where it can be, like, for example, for some of my historical reasons, I have no interest in traveling for the rest of my term. So I likely will not be going to any seminar of any sort for the next 2 years. But you don't want to have a case where you have people who don't want to do continuing education. I mean, we want our counselors to want to learn more. And so that, I mean, you don't want to do something where, again, like, hey, this person has spent $1,000 this year or whatever, you know, jet setting to go to these seminars or whatever. So I get it.
And that's part of the 350-mile radius or restriction that I'm recommending that you add to this document. This area you will more than likely drive to. You won't fly to Minneapolis or Omaha or Des Moines. You're going to drive. And so I think it does create some constraints on the council that they're not jet setting to New York City or name your place that you want to go.
Counselor Neitzer.
I don't remember if, is there anything in there that says, well, I mean, would there be like some sort of a mileage expectation? Like if you're going to Rapid City, but you come back and you got 2,000 miles of mileage to get reimbursed? You know, I mean, you just make a detour to go to the.
Now, exactly. Let me first of all say we have not had that issue. Our counselors are very honest and upfront when they do turn in their.
And the travel, I think the form has an estimate, right?
Yeah.
Of what you.
And I may defer that to Mr. Bixler, who oversees our travel, but I believe that that's actually done through Google.
Yeah. Like if there was a major deviation, you know, like the estimate was 700 miles and you had 2,000 because you went to like, you know, Valley Fair or something on the way. I mean, whatever. I mean, just.
David Bixler, budget analyst. What we do is we just go exactly what Jim said by Google, and it's the mileage to the location and the mileage back. Any mileage within the city itself is not reimbursed.
And actually, a more serious example is there could be a case in which somebody may say, hey, you know, I'm going over to this event across the state, and, you know, there's some other thing in which I'd like to stop over in Pierre, or I want to blah, 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 blah. Is there, I mean, so, you know, I might get another 100 miles or something, and then I just be reimbursed for just the, I don't know.
If we had that documented through the travel request form, then I don't think we'd have an issue. I just don't think you can do it after the fact.
Well, I guess, okay, yeah, very good, thanks.
Are there any other questions? Mr. Greco, would we want to recommend this policy if we saw fit to the July 19th meeting as well?
Mr. Chair, I would recommend, yes, you'll want to make a motion based on Councilor Sales' comments, and I think they're good. Maybe a motion to recommend the proposed changes minus the meeting and events section. I'll remove that to the City Council meeting of July 19th for more research so that we could better hone it. Because to me, it sounded like probably, at least the committee, we probably want to codify more direction in terms of what's on there and how one may use the information that's on there.
Understood.
Which I think is fair.
I'd look for that motion right now.
I so move.
Okay, thank you, Counselor Saylor. Is there a second?
I'll second, Neitzer.
Thank you, Counselor Neitzer. There's a motion and a second on the floor. Is there any discussion? If not, let's go ahead and vote on that motion. If you approve, say yes.
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 If you don't approve, say yes. Okay, that passes. All right, we have come to the fourth item on our agenda. Is there anyone from the public that'd like to come up and make a comment? Okay, seeing none, we will adjourn.